In the spring of 1949, the diplomats gathered in Washington carried with them the memory of 50 million dead and the ruins of a continent that had twice dragged the world into war. They came from 12 nations to sign a treaty that would bind America to the defense of Europe, a commitment that no American president had ever made in peacetime. The men who drafted the North Atlantic Treaty believed they were creating a temporary shield, a protective umbrella while Europe rebuilt its shattered armies and broken economies. General Dwight Eisenhower, the hero of D-Day, was appointed the first supreme commander of the alliance, and he made a prediction that would prove catastrophically wrong. He told Congress that if American troops were still stationed in Europe in 10 years, the entire arrangement would have been a failure of vision and purpose. That was 76 years ago, and today over 100,000 American soldiers still stand guard on European soil, their presence as permanent as the bases they occupy. The temporary shield became a permanent crutch, and the nations America swore to protect never learned to walk on their own 2 feet. This is the story of how the greatest military alliance in history transformed from a bulwark against tyranny into an instrument of European dependency. It is the story of American sacrifice and European complacency, of promises made at summits and broken in budgets, of an alliance that forgot its original purpose. To understand how NATO became a burden for America, we must first return to the ruins from which it rose and the fears that forged it. Before we dive in, why not hit subscribe and drop a like? It really helps out. In 1945, Europe was a graveyard of empires, its ancient cities reduced to rubble, its economies shattered, its people starving in the wreckage of total war. The Soviet Union, despite losing 27 million souls in the conflict, emerged with the largest land army on Earth and an ideology that demanded relentless expansion. Joseph Stalin had already drawn an iron curtain across the heart of the continent, installing puppet governments from Warsaw to Sofia, from Prague to Budapest. The Berlin blockade of 1948 revealed the true nature of Soviet ambition, when Stalin cut off all ground access to West Berlin and attempted to starve 2 million civilians into submission. American and British pilots responded with an aerial lifeline that defied all military logic, all meteorological probability, and all reasonable expectations of success. For 11 months, they flew 277,000 missions, landing a plane every minute at the height of the operation, delivering 2.3 million tons of food and coal. Young American airmen died in crashes over German fields, sacrificing their lives to feed a city that had been their mortal enemy just 3 years before. The message of the Berlin airlift was unmistakable to anyone willing to read it. Without American power, Europe could not survive against Soviet pressure. British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin crossed the Atlantic to deliver a warning to American leaders that bordered on outright desperation. He told them that without a formal commitment, without American boots permanently stationed on European ground, Stalin would be at the English Channel within weeks of any conflict. The United States had never entered a peacetime military alliance outside the Western Hemisphere in its entire 170-year history as a nation. The Founding Fathers had warned against entangling alliances with foreign powers, and for generations America had heeded that advice with religious devotion. But the diplomats in Washington understood that the world had fundamentally changed, that oceans no longer provided safety, that the next war would begin with atomic fire. And so 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty on April 4, 1949, creating an alliance built on a single revolutionary and unprecedented premise. Article 5 declared that an armed attack against one member would be considered an attack against all, binding America's fate to the defense of Western Europe. The United States was now committed to go to war, potentially nuclear war, if Soviet tanks crossed into West Germany or Norway or Italy or any other member state. American cities became hostages for European security, targets for Soviet missiles that would never have threatened the homeland otherwise. It was the most generous security guarantee in the history of nations, offered freely to countries that could never hope to reciprocate the commitment in kind. President Harry Truman called it a shield against aggression, and he believed, as Eisenhower believed, that the shield would one day no longer be needed. Europe would recover its strength, Europe would rearm its armies, Europe would stand on its own feet, and American boys could finally come home to their families. It was a noble vision built on faith in European resolve, a faith that the coming decades would prove to be tragically and repeatedly misplaced. For a brief moment in the early months of the alliance, it seemed the arrangement might work as intended, with Europe slowly rebuilding and America providing temporary cover. Then, on a peninsula half a world away, in the early morning hours of June 25, 1950, everything changed with the thunder of artillery. North Korean troops poured across the 38th parallel in a massive invasion, and Western leaders saw the hand of Moscow testing American resolve on a global scale. The question hung over every capital in Europe like a sword. If America would not fight for Korea, would it fight for Berlin or Paris or London? America answered that question with 36,000 lives, 3 brutal years of combat, and a defense of South Korea that holds to this very day. But the Korean War's impact extended far beyond the mountains and rice paddies of the Pacific theater where American soldiers bled and died. If the Soviets were willing to probe Western resolve in Asia through their proxies, Europe could be the next target for communist expansion. The response came in blood and treasure, as America poured resources into European defense at a scale that would have seemed utterly insane just 5 years earlier. By 1953, the United States was spending over 13% of its gross domestic product on defense, with hundreds of thousands of troops deployed to the European front. American taxpayers funded the construction of enormous military installations across West Germany, sprawling bases that became small American cities planted on foreign soil. Nuclear weapons were deployed to the continent by the thousands, their presence a constant reminder that any Soviet attack would trigger apocalyptic retaliation. The American nuclear umbrella now covered Western Europe completely, and under its comfortable shelter, something strange and troubling began to happen. European governments slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly stopped worrying about their own defense, because someone else was worrying about it for them. The logic was seductive in its simplicity. Why build expensive tanks when the Americans already had tanks stationed on your borders? Why train and equip hundreds of thousands of soldiers when American soldiers were already standing permanent watch on the frontier with the Soviet bloc? Why spend precious treasury funds on missiles and aircraft when American nuclear weapons would reduce Moscow to radioactive ash if war ever came? European governments embraced this logic with enthusiasm because they had other priorities that seemed more pressing than military preparedness. They had economies to rebuild from the ashes, welfare states to construct from scratch, healthcare systems and pensions and universities and infrastructure to fund. Defense spending could wait for another budget cycle, defense could be deferred to next year's parliament, defense could be left to the Americans who seemed so willing to provide it. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, European defense spending steadily declined as a percentage of their rapidly growing economies, while American commitments remained constant or increased. The temporary arrangement was quietly becoming permanent, and no one in the capitals of Europe seemed particularly troubled by this comfortable development. American presidents noticed the growing disparity, and American presidents complained through diplomatic channels, but their complaints fell on ears that had grown deaf to them. President Eisenhower, the same man who had predicted American troops would be gone in 10 years, warned that European free-riding would eventually poison the alliance. President Kennedy demanded greater burden sharing in forceful terms and received polite assurances from European leaders that were never actually honored. President Nixon threatened troop withdrawals and watched European leaders nod sympathetically at summits before returning home to change absolutely nothing. The pattern was established early in the alliance's history and has never been broken. America demands, Europe promises, and nothing fundamentally changes. Defenders of the alliance argue that NATO provides America with strategic benefits that justify the cost, and this argument deserves serious examination. They point to American military bases across Europe, which allow the United States to project power and maintain forward-deployed forces closer to potential threats. They argue that the nuclear missiles stationed on Allied territory, particularly in nations bordering Russia, provide early warning and reduce Moscow's response time in any conflict. They contend that if America did not protect Europe and Russia hypothetically conquered the continent, American security would be the next target for an emboldened Moscow. and they suggest that NATO keeps Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and other hostile nations isolated from beneficial trade relationships with wealthy Western economies. These arguments contain elements of truth, but they collapse under scrutiny when examined against the actual behavior of American allies over the past decade. Consider the trade relationship between NATO allies and Russia, which was supposed to isolate Moscow and pressure the Kremlin through economic consequences. For years after Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, Germany continued building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, increasing European energy dependence on Russian gas. Since you've made it this far, you're clearly enjoying the content, so please hit subscribe and drop a like. It helps more than you think. With that said, let's get back to it. European nations collectively purchased hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Russian oil and gas, funding the very military modernization that now threatens the continent. The same allies who demanded American protection from Russia were simultaneously filling Russian coffers with energy payments that built Russian tanks and missiles. Even after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, European purchases of Russian energy continued for months, with creative accounting disguising the origin of fuel. If NATO was supposed to economically isolate America's adversaries, the alliance failed spectacularly at this basic task, while American taxpayers continued funding European defense. As for the specter of Russian conquest should America withdraw, this scenario ignores a fundamental economic reality. The European Union's combined economy dwarfs Russia's by a factor of 10, meaning European nations possess the industrial and financial capacity to field militaries that would make any Russian westward advance suicidal. They simply choose not to prioritize defense because American taxpayers already guarantee their security. As for the strategic benefit of forward-deployed nuclear capabilities, America does not need NATO's complicated structure to achieve missile defense and early warning. Greenland, the massive Arctic island that sits astride the shortest flight path between Russia and the American heartland, provides everything America needs for strategic defense. American forces have maintained Thule Air Base in northern Greenland since 1951, an installation critical for missile warning, space surveillance, and Arctic operations. Any Russian nuclear missile aimed at the continental United States would fly directly over Greenland, giving American defense systems precious additional minutes to detect and intercept. During World War II, America garrisoned Greenland precisely to prevent Nazi Germany from using the island as a staging ground for attacks on North America. The strategic logic remains unchanged 8 decades later. Whoever controls Greenland controls the air and sea approaches to the entire North American continent. When President Trump recognized this reality and expressed interest in acquiring Greenland, the response from European leaders revealed everything about Allied attitudes toward American security. Danish politicians erupted in outrage and mockery, with the Prime Minister dismissing the American president's concerns as absurd and refusing even to discuss the matter. This is Denmark, a nation of fewer than 6 million people with a military that could not defend its own borders for a single week against any serious adversary. This is a country that spent barely 2% of GDP on defense and relies entirely on American power for protection against the Russian threat it claims to fear. The same Denmark that cannot adequately patrol its own Arctic waters or defend its own territory presumed to lecture the United States about strategic priorities. European leaders treated legitimate American security concerns with contempt, demonstrating that the alliance has become a one-way street of American obligation and European entitlement. The bitter irony is that Greenland could provide America with missile defense benefits without the burden of defending 31 other nations, most of whom refused to defend themselves. In 1966, the alliance faced its first great internal crisis, and the events that unfolded revealed the fundamental asymmetry at the heart of NATO's structure. President Charles de Gaulle of France announced that his nation would withdraw from NATO's integrated military command and demanded that all foreign forces leave French territory. 30,000 American troops were given 1 year to pack their equipment and evacuate, along with the headquarters of the entire alliance itself. France wanted all of the benefits of American protection without any of the inconvenience of American presence or the obligations of integrated command. De Gaulle resented American dominance of the alliance and dreamed of an independent European defense identity led naturally and inevitably by France. When asked if the American evacuation should include the soldiers buried in French military cemeteries, Secretary of State Dean Rusk let the question hang in the air. The silence said everything that needed to be said about the debt that France preferred to forget and the sacrifice that America had made. America had liberated France twice in the 20th century, burying tens of thousands of young men in French soil, and expulsion was the thanks their sacrifice had earned. NATO headquarters moved to Brussels, the American troops departed as ordered, and French independence from American command was loudly declared. But here is the bitter irony that de Gaulle never acknowledged publicly and French politicians still refuse to discuss honestly today. France remained under the full protection of Article 5 despite contributing nothing to the integrated military structures that would coordinate any actual defense. If the Soviets had attacked France, American soldiers would still have been obligated to die defending Paris, even as France refused to participate in Allied planning. France had achieved the perfect arrangement that every dependent secretly dreams of, all of the security guarantees with none of the reciprocal obligations. It was a model that other European nations observed with quiet admiration, and in their own subtle ways, they would eventually emulate it. The Cold War continued for another 25 years after France's withdrawal, and throughout those tense decades, American forces remained the backbone of European defense. 300,000 American soldiers stood permanent watch on the German frontier, their families living in military housing, their children attending American schools on foreign soil. American taxpayers funded this massive deployment year after year, administration after administration, without seriously questioning whether or when it might end. The nuclear guarantee remained in force. American cities remained hostages to European security, and European governments remained content to let someone else pay. Then, in November of 1989, crowds gathered at the Berlin Wall with hammers and chisels, and within hours the entire justification for NATO's existence began crumbling. The wall fell, and with it collapsed the Soviet Empire, the Warsaw Pact, and the ideological confrontation that had defined global politics for 4 decades. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself dissolved into 15 independent republics, its army disintegrating, its ideology utterly discredited, its empire consigned to history. The enemy that NATO had been created to contain, the threat that had justified 7 decades of American commitment, had simply ceased to exist. Lord Ismay, NATO's first Secretary General, had famously defined the alliance's purpose as keeping the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. By 1991, the Russians were mired in chaos, Germany was reunified as a peaceful democracy, and the question of keeping Americans in Europe seemed suddenly irrelevant. This was the moment when the temporary arrangement should have finally ended, when the shield should have been honorably retired, when American troops should have come home. Instead, something remarkable and historically unprecedented happened. The alliance that had lost its enemy decided to expand rather than dissolve. NATO began absorbing the former members of the Soviet bloc, extending American security guarantees further east with each round of enlargement. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined in 1999, followed by 7 more countries in 2004, including 3 nations that had been part of the Soviet Union itself. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, tiny Baltic states perched directly on Russia's northwestern border, were now covered by Article 5 and American protection. American soldiers were pledged to fight and die for countries that most American citizens could not locate on a map or name the capitals of. Each expansion extended American obligations further eastward, while European contributions to collective defense remained frozen in place or continued declining. The alliance grew from 12 founding members to 16, then 19, then 26, and eventually to the current 32 nations. But the American share of the burden did not decrease proportionally with each new member. If anything, it increased as the alliance absorbed weaker states. New members brought new vulnerabilities, new borders to defend, and new demands for protection, but they did not bring military capabilities that meaningfully strengthened the alliance. The expansion was celebrated in Western capitals as the triumph of democracy and freedom, and perhaps in some abstract sense it was exactly that. But it was also the quiet transformation of NATO from a defensive alliance of capable powers into an American security guarantee for an entire continent of dependence. Then on September 11, 2001, terrorists struck the United States, and for the first time in NATO's 52-year history, the alliance invoked Article 5. European leaders declared solemnly that the attack on America was an attack on all alliance members, and they spoke movingly of solidarity and shared sacrifice. It was a powerful symbolic gesture, and it was not entirely empty of substance or meaning, despite what came afterward. NATO allies deployed forces to Afghanistan alongside American troops, and over 1,000 Allied soldiers ultimately gave their lives in that 20-year war. But the reality of Allied support proved considerably more complicated and limited than the stirring rhetoric of solidarity had suggested. Many European nations imposed strict caveats and limitations on their forces, with detailed restrictions on where they could operate and what missions they could perform. German troops were initially forbidden from combat operations in southern Afghanistan, precisely where the Taliban insurgency was strongest and the fighting fiercest. Some Allied contingents seemed designed more to show the flag at press conferences than to actually fight the enemy in the field. American forces bore the overwhelming burden of combat operations, casualties, and financial costs throughout the entire two-decade conflict in Afghanistan. The pattern established during the Cold War held firm even in the post-9/11 era. America fights the wars, Europe assists at the margins, and American taxpayers pay the bill. By 2014, the complacency that had infected European defense establishments for decades had metastasized into something approaching willful and deliberate negligence. Russia had recovered from its post-Soviet collapse, its military modernized with oil revenue, its imperial ambitions revived under the increasingly aggressive leadership of Vladimir Putin. When Russian forces seized Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine, it should have been a thunderclap that finally awakened Europe to the reality of its profound vulnerability. Instead, the response from European capitals was a flurry of emergency meetings, a cascade of strongly worded condemnations, and a promise that would prove almost entirely worthless. At the Wales summit in September 2014, NATO members solemnly pledged to spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product on defense by 2024. 2% was not an ambitious target by any reasonable measure. It was a floor, a bare minimum that still left European militaries far below American levels. The United States consistently spent between 3 and 4% of GDP on defense, roughly double what it was asking its wealthy allies to contribute. At the time of the Wales pledge, only 3 NATO members met even this modest 2% threshold: the United States, the United Kingdom, and Greece. 10 years passed, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and most European allies still had not kept the promise they made at Wales. Germany, the largest economy in Europe and the 4th largest economy in the entire world, spent barely 1.2% on defense for years after the pledge. This was a nation with the resources to field one of the most powerful militaries on earth, choosing instead to shelter under the American umbrella while funding generous social programs. German politicians were remarkably candid about this deliberate choice, with some openly arguing that relying on American protection was simply more efficient than self-defense. The cumulative underspending by European NATO members since the 2014 Wales summit totals over $800 billion compared to what they solemnly promised. $800 billion is not an accounting abstraction or a figure on a spreadsheet. It represents real costs shifted from European taxpayers onto American ones. It represents roads not built in Ohio, schools not funded in Texas, hospitals not constructed in Michigan, and debts that American children will inherit. American taxpayers have effectively subsidized European welfare states for 3 generations, enabling Europeans to enjoy social benefits that working Americans cannot afford for themselves. The average European worker receives 30 days of paid vacation annually. The average American worker receives 10 days, if they receive any at all. Europeans retire earlier, work fewer hours, and receive more generous government services across the board, all made possible in part by defense savings that America covers. This is not a coincidence or an accident of history. It is a direct consequence of the security guarantee that allows European governments to treat defense as optional. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the hollowness of European military power was exposed in humiliating and undeniable detail. Since then, American Congress has allocated approximately $183 billion in aid to Ukraine, with American taxpayers once again funding European security, while European factories struggled to produce enough ammunition for a single front. American weapons, American money, and American logistics have kept Ukraine in the fight, while the wealthy nations of Europe discovered they had allowed their own defense industries to wither into near irrelevance. Germany discovered that its vaunted Bundeswehr, once the steel backbone of NATO's central front during the Cold War, had been allowed to decay into a hollow shell. German soldiers reported training with broomsticks painted black to simulate machine guns because there were not enough actual weapons for everyone to train with. The mighty German army could field barely 50,000 combat-ready troops, a pathetic fraction of its Cold War strength of nearly 500,000 soldiers. The German tank fleet had shrunk from over 2,000 main battle tanks to barely 300 operational vehicles, many of which sat in repair depots awaiting spare parts. The Luftwaffe struggled to keep enough aircraft operational for basic air policing missions over Allied territory, let alone for actual combat operations. This was the military of Europe's richest and most powerful nation, systematically reduced to a hollow training force through decades of willful neglect and budget cuts. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced a special fund of €100 billion for defense modernization, declaring it a historic turning point for German policy. The announcement made headlines around the world and was praised as evidence that Europe had finally awakened, but the reality proved far less dramatic than the rhetoric. The money would be spread over many years, and much of it would go to paying down existing equipment debts and maintenance backlogs rather than building new capability. 3 years after that historic announcement, the German military remains a work in progress, its combat readiness still far below what the threat environment demands. The United Kingdom, traditionally one of NATO's more serious and capable members, has also experienced significant and accelerating military decline in recent years. The Royal Navy, which once ruled the world's oceans and projected British power to every corner of the globe, now operates fewer than 20 major surface warships. British Army strength has fallen to its lowest level since the Napoleonic Wars over 200 years ago, with plans on the books to reduce it even further. France maintains more capable forces than most European allies, but still cannot project military power at any meaningful scale without substantial American support. The NATO intervention in Libya in 2011 demonstrated European military limitations in embarrassing fashion that should have served as a wake-up call. This was a conflict against a third-rate military power on Europe's own southern doorstep, and yet European forces could not sustain operations independently. European militaries ran out of precision-guided munitions within weeks of the campaign's start and had to request emergency resupply from American stockpiles. American aircraft flew the majority of strike missions. American tankers provided aerial refueling, and American intelligence guided virtually the entire campaign from start to finish. If Europe could not handle Muammar Gaddafi's Libya without American help, what realistic chance would it have against a peer adversary like Russia or China? The honest answer is none whatsoever, and European military planners privately acknowledge this reality even if their politicians refuse to say it publicly. Russia maintains over 1 million active-duty military personnel, approximately 12,000 tanks of various types, and the world's largest nuclear arsenal. European NATO members combined cannot match these Russian forces without full American participation, and everyone involved in defense planning understands this uncomfortable reality. The dependency that Eisenhower assumed would be temporary has become structural, embedded in 7 decades of decisions that consistently prioritized comfort over military capability. American leaders from both political parties have issued warnings about this imbalance for 70 years, and for 70 years those warnings have been politely ignored. President Trump broke with diplomatic tradition by criticizing Allied underspending in blunt and public terms that shocked the foreign policy establishment. The establishment condemned his approach as damaging to alliance unity, but Trump was merely saying publicly what every American president since Eisenhower had said privately. At the 2025 NATO summit in The Hague, allies finally agreed to a new target: 5% of GDP on defense and security spending by 2035. This commitment includes 3.5% for core military requirements and 1.5% for infrastructure, resilience, and defense innovation. It took the largest land war in Europe since World War II, a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, and relentless American pressure sustained over years to extract even this pledge. Whether European allies will actually meet these new targets remains deeply uncertain, given that reaching the previous 2% goal took over a decade and a Russian invasion. Their track record of broken promises at summit after summit provides absolutely no basis for confidence that this time will somehow be different. Spain immediately demanded an exemption from the 5% commitment, with Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez capping his country's pledge at just over 2% of GDP. Sanchez argued that 5% was disproportionate and unnecessary, prioritizing Spanish welfare programs over collective defense while still expecting American protection. Beyond defense spending shortfalls, European gratitude for decades of American sacrifice and protection has been conspicuously and consistently absent. The Greenland controversy provides a revealing window into European attitudes toward American security concerns and the contempt beneath the diplomatic pleasantries. European leaders treated legitimate American strategic interests with mockery and dismissal, while simultaneously expecting America to continue guaranteeing their security indefinitely. Americans have given their lives defending Europe in 2 world wars and maintained the peace through 7 decades of Cold War confrontation and beyond. Over 400,000 Americans died in World War II, many of them buried beneath white crosses in European soil they crossed an ocean to liberate. The Marshall Plan poured $13 billion, equivalent to over $150 billion in today's currency, into rebuilding European economies from the ashes of war. American nuclear deterrence prevented Soviet invasion during 40 years of confrontation, with American cities serving as hostages and targets for European security. And yet, European leaders express shock and indignation when America asks for fair burden sharing or raises legitimate concerns about its own strategic interests. The financial cost of maintaining NATO runs into tens of billions of dollars annually for American forces stationed in Europe and the infrastructure that supports them. Beyond direct military expenditures, America provides the intelligence, satellite communications, precision navigation, and logistics that underpin virtually all Allied operations worldwide. When European forces deploy anywhere in the world for any purpose, they typically depend on American strategic airlift, aerial refueling, and real-time intelligence support. The entire edifice of European military capability, such as it is, rests on an American foundation that Europeans have come to take completely for granted. What has America received in return for this extraordinary commitment of blood and treasure spanning 3/4 of a century and 3 generations of soldiers? Allies who consistently fail to meet spending targets they themselves agreed to, criticism when American leaders dare to demand fair treatment, and dependency that shows no sign of ever ending. Some argue that America benefits from NATO through influence, forward positioning, and the ability to shape European policy, and there is some truth in this argument. But nothing in that argument justifies the scale of asymmetry that currently exists, where America provides the muscle and Europe consumes the security it produces. The shield that Eisenhower expected to last 10 years has now lasted 76, and the dependency it fostered has become a permanent feature of the transatlantic relationship. Europe has made a generational choice, exposed over decades of budgets and elections, to rely on American protection rather than develop the capacity to defend itself. That choice was always an option available to sovereign nations, never a strategic necessity made by governments that preferred welfare spending to military investment. NATO did not create European military strength as its founders intended. It substituted American power for European capability and in doing so institutionalized European weakness. The alliance that was forged to contain Soviet aggression and rebuild European defense has instead become an instrument of permanent European dependency on American power. The temporary arrangement became permanent through bureaucratic inertia and political convenience. The promises made at summits remained unkept, and the burden fell on American shoulders alone. 76 years of patience, 76 years of warnings, 76 years of broken pledges have made one conclusion inescapable for anyone willing to examine the evidence honestly. NATO, as currently structured and operated, no longer serves the nation that built it, funds it, and guarantees its security with its own blood and treasure. The question that American policymakers must now confront is not whether the alliance serves American interests, but what America should do about an alliance that has transformed from a temporary shield into a permanent burden, and whether 76 years of dependency can ever truly end. If you found this perspective valuable, consider subscribing. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. Thank you for watching.